Hey friends, welcome back. This is Ashley with Uncommon Roots Homestead, and today I'm over in the garden trying to get a handle on what is happening here. We have some friends in town and we were over here earlier today, and I was just looking at the space and realized that it's out of control. So as we brought our friends out here and we were showing them the garden for the first time, I realized that, well, I already knew this, but I realized that when I stand here and I look at the front half of the garden, I feel good about it, right? It's orderly, it's neat, it's put together. Then I turn around. All right, so yeah, I realized that when I look at the front half of the garden, it feels neat and orderly and tidy, and it feels like everything I want the garden to be, right? It feels like a place of rest and comfort and free of chaos. And then when I turn and I see this other side, it is just a wreck. There, you can't walk, you can't see my lines, there's no order. It just feels like chaos. And I have kind of two things that come to mind when I think about that, right? Like, first is, where do we go from here? How do I take this mess and create something orderly from it? And as much as I don't care if everything is exactly in the right place, I do want this to be a place of production, and I do want this to be a place where I'm getting ultimately what I need out of this garden. And in order to do that, you have to have some level of organization. You have to have some pause to the chaos. And so where do we go from here? Where do I go from this place of disorder, and how do I get it back on track, or to a point where I won't feel as overwhelmed when I come into the garden? And then second to that, it kind of made me start thinking, like, how similar is this to my life, right? Where there's one half that just feels like it's in complete order, and everything has clean lines and things are growing where they're supposed to be. And yeah, there might be a couple weeds here and there, but it's by no means disordered. It's by no means messy. It's just an opportunity for it to be better. So I just see this as such a beautiful picture of what life is, right? Life is not all perfectly organized and structured all of the times. Often we find ourselves in a position where maybe half of our life feels like we've got it together, and half of our, everything feels right. And there might be weeds, and it might be a little messy, and it might not be exactly how we want it, but it feels like we have it under control. And then we turn around and realize that really we had nothing under control, and that there are so many things that are outside of our control. And there are so many things that maybe are overwhelming and they're a little bit of a jungle. And there's still beauty that comes from that. And there is organization that comes from that. And there's structure that comes from that. Everything is not always how we want it to be. And sometimes taking a step back to appreciate the order and the chaos together and how they work in harmony, and how a squash is never going to grow in an orderly fashion. So if I want squash, I have to be able to embrace the chaos, but I can control that chaos by putting my squash in a place that's separate from the rest of the garden. Like, there are ways for us to put guardrails around these things. And the same thing applies to the rest of our lives, right? Like, there is a way to structure the time, the place, the people, the activities in a way that puts guardrails around them, so that things that are chaotic and things that we cannot control are almost given space to be chaotic, and they're given space to be wild. And when we try to let that wild and that jungle and that chaos into our perfectly manicured, organized protege beds, sometimes that feels overwhelming, but sometimes it's exactly what we need. And so, as I sit here, right in the middle of the space in my garden where the chaos meets the structure, Kevin recently mowed, so it feels even more magnified when I look at this space, because it's so manicured and then so crazy. All I can think is that there is somewhere that we go from here, and there is learning to be had here in this space and as a reflection of the rest of the spaces in my life. So, bring it back to the garden. Where do we go from here? Let's go take a look and I'll tell you. So, the first kind of bit of chaos are these production tomatoes. So, the biggest mistake that I have made this gardening season is not getting these tomatoes under control when I got all the rest under control. I was intimidated by it. I did come and start pruning, but I really needed to keep up with it. These are half big boys, which are indeterminate, and half San Marzanos, which are determinate. That was a mistake. In and of itself, I should have separated those to make it easier for me to see, okay, which plants need to be heavily pruned and which don't. I needed to come out and tie them up better, because now they're just falling into the rows. But where I go from here, it's not too late to prune these tomatoes. It's not too late to come out and start adding some structure back to these. I'm not going to be pruning my San Marzanos because they are indeterminate, but I do have a lot of space to start pruning my indeterminate varieties. And sorry, San Marzanos are determinate. I think I might have just said that wrong. So that's where we go from here. And there's already a lot of fruit that I see that needs to be picked. So sometimes when you're bringing the chaos into order, the fruit is not lost on you. There is something to be harvested, and there's something to be enjoyed in that transition, even as you are cleaning something up. So if we're talking about the garden, that's true, right? I'm gonna find lots of fruit as I go to prune those plants. If you're talking about your life, that can be true. You're going to find lots of fruit as you clean up those things. So together, we'll get those tomato plants under control. That's number one on my list. I'm gonna go set this tomato down. So that brings us to this. So I knew that this was going to be a jungle, right? I knew that this space was going to be overwhelming. Squash is notorious for that. Like I said, you can't really rein it in. It's not a thing. So how do we move forward from there when it's not really a thing to clean it up? It's going to be wild. It's going to go where it wants to go. I want the fruit at the end of it. My plan is to take lots of learnings from this year, because I probably should have done this in its own space. My biggest fear is that right back here, those are my melons. So melons, unlike squash, do need to be harvested and picked when they're ready. Squash, they grow, winter squash, they grow, they harden, and then they actually cure, usually on the vine. So you can let the vines completely die back and leave those squash there. Melons, not so much. They will rot on the vine if you do not pick them and bring them inside and enjoy them with your family. And so my fear with what I've done here and this lack of organization and the chaos that's ensued is that I'm going to miss that fruit because there's not a great way to get in there. So my plan is my summer squash is getting close to being done. We're mid-July right now, East Tennessee, Zone 7A. Our days are getting up to, not 100, but 90s, mid-90s. The humidity is hot. Squash bugs are coming out. I'm starting to see some damage on those plants. I've gotten a lot of zucchini and summer squash already. My plan is to pull those out as soon as they're, close to being done producing. That gives me a clear line to those melons. So then what I'll do is literally go in and walk through this chaos every couple days and check for melons and try to make sure that I don't miss anything. That's not super ideal, right? In hindsight, I would put my melons in a place that's separate from my squash instead of doing them side by side. The squash just runs like crazy, and everything is so healthy. It's almost the hardest part is that it's so healthy. But I know that in order to enjoy both fruits, my squash and my melons, I need to get that under control. So that's what I'm going to do next year. The other thing that I'm going to do this year, moving them will be next year. So this year I'm going to just get in there and check for them. The other thing that's going to happen is that we are not super far from harvesting sweet potatoes. So in the next month or so, I should be able to harvest some of these sweet potatoes, clear out this line, which will allow me to see a little bit better into those melons and also allow me to bring some more order to this bed. I'll be topping it with mulch so that those pathways are clear. I'm going to be laying more cardboard down in the walkways and trying to really just bring order back into this space. And then next year, I'm going to keep these rows in ground here. But like I said, I'm probably not going to do my squash right here in the main portion of this potager garden. And if I do, I won't do anything else that needs to be harvested around it. So I would do, my summer squash somewhere else and my melons somewhere else so that the squash just has this whole area, which is a real possibility. I could definitely do that. So that's my plan here. I think that for me, I'm going to feel better about all of this when I can get these production tomatoes under control and start to clear some lines so that I can actually navigate through these plants a little bit better. I think what makes it so intimidating to me, and my parents' farm sat for us a couple days ago when we were in Florida, and my mom said, your garden is beautiful, but it is overwhelming. And I thought when I got home and just saw how much the squash had taken over and how much growth that we've seen in such a short period of time, I thought, yeah, overwhelming is the word for this. It is overwhelming and it is chaotic and it feels like a space that gives me a little bit of anxiety being in this side. And so I think that getting the tomatoes under control, cleaning up some of the things that can be cleaned up, that's going to help. But the biggest thing that I'm going to do to help move forward, where do I go from here, is spend time here. Sometimes I think that chaos and the feeling of overwhelm and chaos comes from our discomfort being in a space that we don't control. And so my goal is to be in this space and enjoy this space and find comfort in knowing that it is all going to turn out. And even if I can't control this chaos, even if this takes over this half of the garden, that it's okay to just be here. And not all is lost. There's still fruit. I will still harvest lots of fruit. And I'm still learning. And even after all of that, this is still my favorite place to be. And I do think that the more time I spend here in this side of the garden, in my little chair, the more I'll learn to appreciate what's happening here. That not all things that seem chaotic are bad, and that not all things that are outside of my control are uncontrollable, and that there is value in this space, even if it brings me a little bit of anxiety. So I think there's so much real life comparison here, truth about gardening and letting go of your expectations, and ultimately food. There's a lot of food there. And I have to remember that if I take 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 steps, I'm back to this space. And together, this garden is complete. And if it all looked like this, I wouldn't have any squash, and I wouldn't have any melons, and I wouldn't have any sweet potatoes, and I wouldn't have any corn, and I wouldn't have any sunflowers. And if it all looked like that, I wouldn't have my herbs, and I wouldn't have my peppers, and I wouldn't have my potatoes. And I think that it's just understanding that all of these things come together to create this beautiful chaos. That's exactly how it's supposed to be. And I'm okay with that. I'm okay with letting these plants be the way that they're supposed to be. And could I go through and prune my squash? Absolutely. I could go in, I could prune, I could try to clean these up, I could pull plants, I could thin, I could make this space feel better to me. But I don't think that that actually helps me at all. I think that what helps me is knowing that there's value in the way that this is, and that if I can learn to be still in that space of chaos, then there's more for me to gain. So that's what's on my mind today. I'm also seeing lots of tomatoes that I need to come pick. Look how beautiful those look. Let's go find Bree and Brandon. She chasing you? Jeannie's yelling at her. Hey, Jeannie Mama. Oh, is he playing with your baby? Hi. You're good, Mama. Let's see. You're pretty empty, huh? We gotta start separating you two. She's clearing you out. Well, friends, this is my friend Bree.
Hello.
And I'm gonna go spend some time with them. I think we're gonna maybe try to catch a cow. I don't know, Brandon's been trying and it's not been super successful, so we'll see. I'll update you. But thank you for joining me today in the garden. You always have a space here. Until next time.